Good morning, everybody who is in our session. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. To my left, you can see Christine Fürst. She is the moderator for the entire morning session, but for this session, she no longer have a specific task to fulfill. So I will just start with a brief introduction about the session, and will then hand over to Eszter Kelemen. She is my co-moderator of this session, and since she is one of the speakers, the second speaker, so I start by moderating this session and then hand over to her when she has given her presentation. In this session, we will have a look at another approach, how we can halt and stop biodiversity loss. And we will take in this session a critical look at transdisciplinary approaches and at the use of real-world laboratories to find out how successful they can be actually in halting biodiversity loss or even in reversing biodiversity loss. And we will ask this question if these strategies are really successful. So we will have a look at these strategies, transdisciplinary approaches and real-world labs, and ask if they are really successful, and if not, how can we use these technologies. Eszter Kelemen from the Environmental Social Science Research Group in Hungary. This institution, Environmental Social Science Research Group, is a small non-profit research company that was co-founded by Eszter, and her background is she has a master degree in economics and a PhD in environmental sciences. So she links indeed the social sciences, if you like, and environmental natural sciences. And she is an expert, internationally renowned expert in science policy interactions. And as such, she's also involved in an important EU program, BioAgora, and this is part of her presentation today. The title is BioAgora, Connecting Biodiversity Knowledge and Decision-Making for Transformative Change. Eszter.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and also thanks for being a speaker at this conference. I hope that you will be able to hear me well, because there were some problems with my voice when we tested it. Yes, and then let's talk a little bit about science policy interfaces. And I think that the previous presentation was just a really good start, because Frank talked a lot about how to make knowledge co-production effective and well-working, well-functioning at the local and regional scales. And basically my talk will be about how to make it effective and well-functioning at EU or global scales. So the presentation will start with very briefly talking about why is it so difficult to implement biodiversity policies. And then I will explain the concept of science policy interfaces, because these were established in order to make policy implementation better or more efficient by providing the best available knowledge. But still what we see is that there are certain gaps and capacity needs, so I will talk them a little bit about as well. And I will arrive at one potential solution which this project aims to put together. And how this material was brought together. So in this BioAgora project, we already conducted a huge number of interviews and surveys and workshops and literature reviews. So basically I will also try to use all this empirical material as the background of my presentation, which, as the data was basically collected in qualitative ways, also the analysis will highlight mostly the qualitative aspects using a grounded theory approach. And if you are interested in some of these ideas which I will share, or maybe some of the figures which will be not so easy to see, or would like to dig a deeper into that, there are already 2 reports available at the BioAgora community at Zenode. Also feel free to check that. There are several deliverables already uploaded there. And then now just see of these implementation challenges. So already yesterday we talked a lot about biodiversity policies, and also about the fact that the EU is kind of a forerunner in terms of prioritizing biodiversity, for instance in the Green Deal, but we can also see it with the recent launch of the Nature Restoration Law. Biodiversity strategies are launched every 10 years at the EU level with very ambitious objectives and goals. And we could imagine that seeing this concerted effort at the EU scale, there should be serious improvements at the biodiversity measures as well. But if we refer back to the data presented by Markus Fischer this morning from the regional assessment of IBES, we still saw there a lot of red notes, if you remember, showing that nature's contribution to people or ecosystem services are not necessarily improving despite all these policy efforts. So what can be the reason for this? Based on expert interviews and literature reviews, what we figured out is a very complex system of interlinked challenges. First of all, it's definitely a very serious challenge of how to mainstream biodiversity into different sectoral policies. So this we could call horizontal policy coherence. But then also there is a vertical aspect of policy implementation, because we can develop the best ever biodiversity strategy at the EU level and also at national levels, but basically the implementation happens at the local scale, at the level of the land users. So we need to streamline these policy objectives and policy measures from the bottom to the top and vice versa. And that also needs funding. So these are the more general challenges, I would say. And then looking more at the practical side, then we see that there are challenges regarding management effectiveness and systematic spatial planning. So how can we ensure that the objectives for biodiversity conservation or restoration, what we all agreed, are really taken up at local level, regional level decisions, and how they are not scored down when there is a trade-off. Maybe one very important guarantee here is engagement of the widest range of stakeholders, because if there is a common understanding and a common will, then all these challenges can be more easily resolved. And then what you see in the center of the figure is the accessibility of knowledge, which we found again many times coming back in our expert interviews, that although we have tons of knowledge, tons of scientific results, these are not necessarily easy to digest and accessible for the wide range of actors. And this was also mentioned yesterday in one of the morning presentations, I guess, that still, and also in Zsolt Molnár's presentation in the afternoon, that the lack of knowledge is also, the accessibility of knowledge is also a cause of conflicts. But we cannot resolve any of these interwoven challenges if we are not seeing the big picture, which is the gray circle, that all these processes are embedded into the current economic and political structures. And as one of our interviewees stated, What we are trying to do currently, unsuccessfully, is to create sustainability through an unsustainable political and economic structure. So it's very important to realize that without really trying to change these underlying political and economic structures we are embedded in, it's very difficult to achieve transformation in terms of restoring nature or conserving it. Okay, if we go further a little bit, then basically the idea of science policy interfaces were created in order to make science better and policy better by increasing science's policy relevance and at the same time increasing the evidence base of policy decisions, and by highlighting that there are different consequences of different policy alternatives, and hopefully by this increased evidence base, if you remember to the central part of the figure I showed before. So we hope that if we increase this evidence base, if we improve the accessibility of knowledge, then that will lead to better decisions in terms of nature restoration and conservation. All this can or should be achieved through non-linear processes between science and policy, which refers to mutual knowledge sharing, co-production, if you like, and also inter- and transdisciplinarity through a cross-sectoral dialogue. This all sounds brilliant, right? And we all know that there are a lot of examples for science policy interfaces, starting with IPCC and IPBES, and at the EU level there is also Eclipse or Biodiversity Plus, which we can consider as SPIs. But what we can see in recent literature, that there are a lot of question marks raised that these science policy interfaces in the climate, in the health, in the biodiversity domain doesn't seem to fulfill their original objectives, or at least not being as impactful as we wished them to be. And then we can just ask again, why are these established SPIs are not delivering their impacts as we wish so? So another study in BioAgora, we looked at these existing gaps which still limit the effective functioning of science policy interactions. And here again, what you see in this figure, I won't go into it in all the details, but what you see in this figure is that there are again a lot of interwoven gaps in terms of individual gaps in competencies or skills, what is basically the inner part of this figure, ranging towards organizational capacities and organizational resources which are lacking. And then if we look at the purple, the outer circle, we again arrive at the systematic gaps or systematic challenges related to vested interests and complexity. And what we see is that most of the SPI efforts focus on the inner circles, like the knowledge and the individual competencies to really communicate better and understanding policy making better and bringing in diverse knowledges, etc. But we are not changing our institutional structures, and therefore all these efforts in the middle of the figure will not be impactful enough. So if we would like to make a real change, then we should think about the interaction between these gaps and trying to target them in a systematic way. Like, for instance, if we would like to engage diverse values and worldviews in a science policy process, we need to enable competencies to co-produce knowledge. But then, in order to reach that, we need an institutional structure, we need organizations, our research organizations, which enable us to include wide range of actors, bringing people together, where we can have support in facilitation, resources denoted to that, right? So we need to think in terms of systematic interactions between these gaps in order to enable change. And then what BioAgora tries to do is to establish a science policy interface or a science service which follows this idea of a systematic, transformative science policy interface. First of all, what is very important is that all these efforts to create this science service tries to embed the future science service into the existing institutional landscape. So it will be part of the Joint Research Center to ensure its legitimacy and continuity. It will be linked, well, it is already linked to the work of the European Biodiversity Platform, where there are representatives of every member state governments discussing twice in every year the status of biodiversity policy in their countries and at the European scale. And this is to ensure the vertical and horizontal coherence. And then we also aim to collaborate with the existing SPI actors to avoid duplications. And via this embedded approach, we hope to fulfill three main functions: supporting active thematic networks, synthesizing knowledge, and transforming policy and scientific processes equally through, for instance, agile way of working, trainings provided, but also by creating and testing new methods of synthesizing knowledge through, for instance, the engagement of various knowledge holders, not just scientific knowledge, but also other knowledge holders. So if you are interested in how to collaborate with BioAgora, we have now an open call for cascade funding, which you can check if you click on this QR code. And also you can check other news from the project in its different communication channels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eszter, for a wonderful presentation, a wonderful project, and also for staying in time. This is perfect timing. Thanks a lot. And now I directly hand over to you to moderate the rest of this session. And I'm really looking forward to the next two presentations.
Ranjini is a junior professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. She has a PhD at the University of Manipuri in India. And basically she is an interdisciplinary conservation scientist working in many different topics, from leopard conservation to the values and worldviews of local people. So I think that her presentation will be also a very exciting one. And it is titled Engaging Diverse Worldviews to Meet Global Biodiversity Targets. So over to you, Ranjini.
Thanks so much, Eszter, and thank you very much for the invitation. Sorry, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, one sec. I'm just... Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about looking at diverse worldviews. I think this also links to a little bit of what Eszter was talking about, right? Like, how do we think of the larger institutional structures or, you know, program design when we want to engage diverse worldviews and values when we want to meet especially global biodiversity targets. So to begin with, I'd like to start with a little story. So the picture that you see here is Spiti Valley. This is in India. It's in the Indian Trans-Himalayas. It's an agro-pastoral community here. And this is also where I did my PhD many years ago. And for one of my questions for my PhD, I want to translate the term nature into the local language because I needed it for like a questionnaire survey. And when I was trying to do that, it was really hard to do because there was no local term for nature. And at that time, for me, this was really hard to understand because I was like, how can there be no local term for nature? But really what it boils down to, and as a young scientist, this ended up having a lot of problems for me for my study design and having to reconceptualize or think of it in different ways. But what I realized there was that this idea of nature, the concept of nature that was not present in the local dialect in Spiti Valley was not unique just to Spiti, but it's also unique to many cultures across the world that don't have a term for nature. What that essentially means is also because people don't see nature as separate from themselves, where people are in nature. So often the term and the concept of nature doesn't exist in such cultures. So this really boils down to the way that communities and individuals see the world. And we could think of this as worldviews, right? So worldviews can be thought of metaphorical lenses through which individuals, social groups, communities, societies, cultures perceive, interpret, shape, and inhabit the world, and in turn are also influenced by the worldviews. And this idea of worldviews has always, like for social scientists, for anthropologists, the connection between worldviews and cultural conservation and biodiversity has been established years ago, but it's still newer in the conservation sciences. And most recently, it was adopted by the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, where they recognized that to meet some of the targets, such as 30 by 30, it was essential to include multiple worldviews and multiple values in biodiversity conservation and practice. And similarly, recently, the NB-SAPs the National Biodiversity Action Plans are going to be rewritten, and it is important that multiple worldviews are included in this rewrite for many countries. But how can this be done? Because it's like understanding worldviews can be pretty complex, because it's not so easy to identify them, and it can be messy. So today in this talk, I want to present the work that was done by colleagues and myself to try to bring some conceptual clarity to worldviews that can help us navigate diverse worldviews. What we do is we build on the IBES classification of worldviews. We expand on concepts, and in the hope that this tool would be useful to the conservation community, both practice and research, to navigate worldview plurality. I then discuss 2 case studies to draw on strategies through which multiple worldviews could be incorporated into existing conservation policies. Right. So to begin with, we focus primarily on human nature worldviews. So these can be thought of worldviews that shape how we relate to other than the human world around us. And then the worldviews are often like the deepest layer of human nature relationships, right? They are influenced by knowledge systems and values, and in turn influence knowledge systems and values. So in this context, we think of knowledge systems as cumulative bodies of knowledge, practice, identities, ethics, and beliefs, which are culturally transmitted across generations. And values refer to what individuals or social groups consider important and why. And there are very broadly 2 different kinds of values. We're looking at broad values, which are like the broad guiding principles, specific values, intrinsic, instrumental, relational, which are like values that are in specific and contextual contexts. Right? So this, again, like we've categorized it into 4 different kind of worldviews: anthropocentric, biocentric, ecocentric, and pluricentric. This is based on the IBES values assessment literature of different sources, and we've built on existing definitions. But I do want to underscore that these are not really static silos, but we think of them rather as fuzzy with overlapping boundaries. And what we're trying to do here is broadly define 4 domains that encompass predominant definitions that were in the literature, as well as try to address inconsistencies in the usage. Right. So coming to the first domain, anthropocentrism. So this was actually the most common worldview that we encountered in the literature. So it encompasses a strong to a weak gradient. So both strong and weak anthropocentrism consider humans as the source of value, but strong anthropocentrism conceives humans independently of nature, right? And they're superior to other species. It prioritizes instrumental values and could be most associated with the positivist scientific and philosophical traditions. Weak anthropocentrism also considers humans as a source of value, but they see them as interconnected with other than humans and nature-based processes. It includes largely instrumental values, but also some relational values such as aesthetics, place, cultural identities, dependencies. They can be associated with knowledge systems like constructivist and transformative systemic and philosophical traditions. So then we look at biocentrism, and this puts life at the center of model consideration, right? So individual species, individual animals. And biocentrism often has an implicit assumption as well of human nature duality. And prioritizes intrinsic values. These are often associated with knowledge systems that use biological criteria to determine sentience. So, for example, animal welfare, rights activists, ecological justice scholars. Looking at ecocentrism puts nature at the center of model consideration, and it highlights collectives and relationships. So concepts like ecological stability are important within the ecocentrism perspective. Again, here there are new human nature duality, but in this case, people are more embedded in the system where relationships between people and ecosystems are considered, but often people are perceived as threats to the ecosystem that might be affecting the stability of an ecosystem. So again, mostly intrinsic values, but also to some extent relational values. This worldview is mostly associated with knowledge systems built on existing like ecological sciences and philosophies. For example, conservation biology, deep ecology. These are some knowledge systems that come from ecocentrism. And lastly, we have pluricentrism. So this was a term that was coined by the IPES assessment to try to identify worldviews that didn't have this center periphery model or like a human nature duality, but it encompasses ways of understanding the world as a relational sphere or a network of interdependencies, and can also include the spiritual world, right? So there is no human nature duality in this conception. This worldview largely emphasizes relational values. The knowledge systems that are often associated with this worldview include indigenous and local knowledge traditions, practice-oriented knowledge, and Western activist traditions as well could be thought of as pluricentric approach, such as ecofeminism as well. Right. So, but when we think of trying to engage multiple worldviews, often the main issue is power, and power dynamics underlie which worldviews get expressed in conservation and conservation research practice. And often the predominant worldview, because of different kinds of power structures, end up shaping conservation practice research. Right. So in this, within this context, we like to think of power in along two axes: discursive power and structural power. So discursive power refers to the ability to produce knowledge. It shapes, builds, or dismisses worldviews based on constructed narratives through language and practice. And with structural power, it refers to contextually specific socio-cultural, political, and economic systems that perpetuate positions and hierarchies amongst different social groups, right? That can lead to also exclusion of social groups within these contexts. So after introducing all of this, we're now trying to bring it together while looking at two case studies to see how diverse worldviews were incorporated in existing conservation practice, and by also challenging the different power, discursive power and structural power within these contexts. So I'd like to first introduce the first case study, where we look at the Biligiri Ranga Hills. Information for this case study was largely collated through literature reviews, as well as the Global Justice Atlas. Information was collated from there as well. So what we have here, so the Biligiri Ranga Hills are in southern India. So these hills are also home to the Soliga community and who have lived here for generations. So their worldview can be described as pluricentric, which is a mix of animism and Hinduism. So they used to also use traditional practices such as Schündeln agriculture, which is slash and burn agriculture within the forest, to practice also subsistence agriculture. Right. So, and at that time, it was also thought that this slash and burn practices also helped, help prevent the spread of invasive species such as lantana. Right. So in 1972, the Indian government passed the Wildlife Protection Act, which aimed to protect forests using a fortress model of conservation. Right. So this had the underlying worldview of the act was largely biocentric and ecocentric perspectives. And this excluded people from using forests because people were seen as a threat. So this resulted in violent eviction and displacement of the Soliga community from many of the forest areas that they occupied, and it also further restricted their use and access to these areas, right? So some scholars say that the removal of the Soliga ended up also them having to stop some of their practices, such as slash and burn agriculture, that even also led to the further spread of lantana within the forest. In 2006, in large part due to activities by human rights NGOs, Indian Parliament passed the Forest Rights Act to reverse historical injustice and promote rights-based conservation. Right, so this act helped the Soliga regain some of their earlier claims to the forest, and they were able to access some parts of the forest as well. But then again, in 2011, the same forest area was declared as a tiger reserve. So here again, because it was focused on a single animal, you can think of it as a biocentric perspective. And following this, the Soliga again faced eviction from the forest. But after this, recognizing the threat that they were under, they formed a grassroots collective that was called the Zili Buddha Kutta Giri Ganjana Abhivardhana Sangha, which was formed to advocate for community territory rights. So now very quickly, I'm going to go through some of the strategies that the community employed in gaining back a lot of their discursive and structural power and incorporate their worldview into forest management, right? So this collective was largely grassroots led, and it promoted local organization. And it strengthened the capacity of the community to self-organize. The collective also informed one of the main jobs that the collective undertook was to inform the whole community of the Soligas about their rights under the Forest Rights Act, as well as the threat that they were under eviction. So to also use knowledge to mobilize the community to fight for their rights. They were also able to expand the coalition to include NGOs that were sympathetic to their cause. And then they promoted collective action. And then through this, they were then better able to access procedural justice, including filing a court case, which they actually won, making this the first community to live within a tiger reserve in India. Right. So, and through the case, they've been granted their Forest Rights Act, they've been granted rights into the forest, and they've regained some of the structural rights, which include, being able to access and use the forest in different ways. There's still some rights, such as slash and burn agriculture, that's not permitted, but other types of rights, which mean like non-forest timber produce collections and grazing and other rights have been given to them. And they've also been recognized to help co-manage parts of the forest along with the forest department. So in this case, if we look at the underlying worldview and power expressions, the first few cases where we had the Wildlife Act and then followed by the Tiger Act had more of an ecocentric and biocentric worldview, which underlined the original acts, which was seeing, which was framing the Soliga as threats to the forest, and the power within this were held by the states as well as other conservation NGOs that went into providing guidance to the state while structuring these acts. And then this was the Soligas held more of a pluricentric worldview, and they were able to, in some senses, take back some of the discursive power through the Sangha, that's the collective that they created, which helped them go to court by reframing their positionality, using their worldviews and the way that they see the forest. And this finally helped them also regain structural power, which helped them regain structural power and enable them to also help in the co-management of the protected area. Right, so this is one case study that we looked at. Now coming to the second case study, this is looking at payments for...
Sorry, Ranjini, your time is basically up, so could you please conclude?
Okay, sorry. Okay, so then I think I'll just go into looking the final one where we're looking at, so for the payments for ecosystem case studies, I guess I can finish it in a couple of sentences. Largely payments for ecosystem services come from an anthropocentric perspective, but in this case, which was in the Jamundi community in Colombia, they tried using collective approaches and focusing on solidarity and focusing on relational values in addition to payments, to make it more inclusive of other worldviews, or also recognizing what might be important to local communities. Because in this region as well, they've been facing a lot of the area has been under threats because of illegal coca cultivation, and threats from guerrilla groups who were not so happy with the peace agreement. So in this instance, the communities wanted better social networks. They wanted help to also resist pressures into converting their lands into coca cultivation. So the payment for ecosystem services not just focused on economic incentives, but also linked into trying to incorporate these other values that were important by the community, by including different stakeholders, focusing on solidarity, focusing on building social networks, right, to have a more inclusive payments for ecosystem services model there. So finally, to conclude, worldviews underlie our conservation and research practice, and often the more powerful sectors, their worldviews get expressed. So engaging multiple worldviews can help achieve more just conservation outcomes, especially if we're considering human well-being parameters as well. So this tool that we've presented that tries to delimit for different worldviews can be used as a tool that can look at self-reflection and practical engagement, and also recognize that a variety of context-specific strategies need to be incorporated to include multiple worldviews in conservation practice and to challenge power. Cool, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ranjini, for this also very exciting presentation, and it was really nice to see a non-European example as well. So thanks a lot. And we already have quite some questions in the Q&A section, and some of them are already responded by the presenters. Also, thanks for that. So first, maybe I would like to pick a question, just a minute, because now I can't see them, but yes, here we are, which was, I think, originally posted to Frank, but actually I think that maybe there are others who might have some interesting input to that. And this was about living labs and the challenges with living labs. So one of our participants highlighted in the Q&A that they face significant challenges due to projectification, like rigid timelines, deliverables, limited flexibility. So how can we make it, how can we ensure that living labs are flexible enough to mitigate the impacts of projectification? And maybe beside Frank, maybe Ranjini, you also have some ideas on that, or Matthias. So first, Frank, go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks for this question. The observation is absolutely valid that many of the present funding schemes do not take sufficient account of the special characteristics of living lab related research. There are two ways around it. One is that on the institutional side, as far as our research institutions are concerned, we have the infrastructures in order to support research within a living lab context. That's, of course, in an idealized world, a situation that many institutions will not have in a short term. But if an institution is able to dedicate research and build infrastructures that in the mid and longer term can support research in living lab contexts, that will be extremely helpful and supportive for this work. That's on the one side. And the other part of the answer refers to the funder, the funding agencies. We have had several exchanges with funding agencies in order to alert and make them sensitive to those sort of issues. That when it comes to living lab related research, there needs to be a certain time horizon. There need to be also compensation funds for actors when they do certain activities in a living lab context. The farmers won't do certain things for free if they have extra work related to certain innovations that they are supposed to implement. And there is growing awareness, and we see that first programs actually take consideration of that and provide longer time horizons for funding and also opportunities for compensation. These are just two examples that need to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the other panelists, whether you would like to add anything on this. From my perspective, I fully agree with you, and that was basically when I was referring always to the broader institutional and organizational background of science policy dialogues. I always was thinking about this, that for instance, projectification can be defeated if our scientific organizations become much more flexible and more open towards new types of collaborations, also more inclusive in terms of what kind of knowledge we accept as relevant knowledge, and how to work with these different knowledge holders. I would be also interested in Ranjini's opinion, maybe, as you mentioned that your second case was about PES. So how you see this?
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts actually, because one is the second case that we were presenting, but the other case I work in pastoral systems where we have like PS-like programs, right, to help with conservation interventions. And one of the things that we really struggle with is also thinking of what the local mechanisms of investments look like, because very often there aren't alternative investment practices, right? So like if we're looking at agro-pastoral societies or pastoral societies, their primary investment is livestock. So livestock is not just like a finance incentive, it's just not like a money-making livelihood. It's also a way of investing any excess money they have in the system. And often in many of the countries that we work in, the banking sector is not that stable. And people have had bad experiences with the banking sector, right? Like where people have lost all their money and all their savings from banking. So often like continuing to invest in livestock is the safest and most risk-free option. So that's something that we've really been struggling with, and we don't completely know how to solve that, because you can't, unless people have alternative, safe ways of investing money that is given to them, they will continue investing in patterns that are safe, right? And at the same time, if we push them to invest more in like banking or other kind of systems, and that were to collapse, which has happened before, you end up making them also more risk, and that's also a lot of responsibility that you have to take on. So that's one aspect that I also want to flag, which is something that we've been personally struggling with at the local scale. And I think that's pretty common in many pastoral systems where livestock is also an investment. That's one. The second thing that we were talking about, the second case study, is we've noticed, I mean, when payments for ecosystem services are often also framed including relational values, right? Like not just economic incentives, but also like flagging the other connections that people have with nature and including relational perspectives and co-creating these systems. They can prevent erosion. There's some studies to indicate that it can prevent erosion of these relational values, and make it such that when the payment stops, it might increase, cutting down the forest.
Thank you, Ranjini. There was one question which I think is interesting to all the speakers, and it is about power. So Ranjini already mentioned this during her presentation, but I think that we can all reflect on it a little bit. So how to address unequal power relations in transdisciplinary processes, but I also think that when there is a money transfer or a financial subsidy, there is also power impacted there. So who receives the money and how distributes the money, that also makes certain people in more powerful positions than others. So I would be really excited to hear your reflections on what to do with all these power asymmetries. Are these influencing biodiversity outcomes or not? And can we alleviate them somehow? Frank, maybe if you can start.
Yes, I think that's an important point, and something to have continuously an eye on. I believe that with the living lab approach, where sort of actors interact on the same eye height, if you want so, you have a mode, potentially you have a mode to bring up those issues regularly, and you should, in order to discuss that regularly when actors meet, to which extent certain power dynamics actually take over and drive the whole group away from the original purpose of the living lab activities. That refers, of course, a good moderation, a good coordination, but potentially it should be possible within that concept to also address power imbalances. In addition to that, I think there's a role for research, as well as like in an observing role, in an also analyzing role to investigate, study how the group behaves, how the group dynamic actually develops, and then feed back that insight into the actor exchange, whether or not certain power dynamics take over, which are not good for the process itself. So those two aspects I can see as a response to that question, but it is important. There's always power dynamics, and we need to be aware of that.
Thank you. Ranjini, I would also like to ask you for a brief reflection on that before closing the session.
I mean, I think like Frank said, power exists everywhere, and it exists in different forms, and there's different ways of power. So I think it's really complex, and it's also very context specific, and it depends on the kind of power that you're trying to challenge, that you're trying to manage. So if we would take the case of setting up a conservation intervention, or setting up a program, designing a program, in which case the conservation practitioners might be the people in charge of implementing it. Firstly, they also have a lot of power, and there's some kind of reflection that needs to happen on how you are changing that system. But perhaps like community engagement, creating deliberative spaces, trying to understand within the community as well what the power hierarchies are like, what are the different dimensions of it, gender. I mean, in India, we have caste, class, like Matthias also said, like elite capture, and how do you manage these power within within these spaces? So creating a lot more deliberative spaces and trying to manage this, I think, at a very local level is possible. But I think then then there's again different kinds of it. You're going up against the state, which can be more challenging, maybe thinking of, what do you have at your proposal to challenge power in that case? So I think it really depends on the kind of power and at which level that you're challenging it.
Thanks so much, and thank you for all of you for participating in the session and sharing your thoughts and your research results. I think it was a very, very valuable contribution to the conference. And before moving to the lunch break, we have now a 30 minutes slot for networking. So I was asked by the organizers to advertise a little bit this networking part, which you can access through the conference platform online.
And I was asked by the organizers actually to point out that you can find an evaluation form on the platform, and please use it by answering the questions there, because we would like to improve our system, and for that we actually need your response, what you feel about this conference, what are your suggestions, how we can improve it. So you find the evaluation sheet on the platform, and please use it.